verdict and the guilty party will be taken out and justice will be administered shortly. I'm Alan Elsner, Vice President of Communications for J Street. Our guest today is Kelsey Davenport, Director of the Nonproliferation Policy at the Arms Control Association. And the subject of our conversation is going to be the negotiations with Iran, obviously, which are still going on in Lausanne last time we checked. Just a few words about Kelsey. She provides research and analysis on nuclear and missile programs in Iran, North Korea, India, and Pakistan, and on nuclear security issues, and reports on developments in these areas for arms control today. She's been with the Arms Control Association since 2011 and is the Herbert Scoville Jr. Peace Fellow. Prior to coming to the Arms Control Association, Kelsey worked for a think tank in Jerusalem, researching regional security issues and track 2 diplomatic negotiations. She holds a master's degree in peace studies from the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and she graduated summa cum laude from Butler University with a BA in International Studies and Political Science. So welcome, Kelsey. Thank you very much for being with us. And my first and obvious question is, what's happening in Lausanne?
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a very fluid situation in Lausanne right now. Iran and the 6 world powers, which includes the United States, France, Germany, China, Russia, and the United Kingdom, also known as the P5+1, are very close to making an announcement about the broad parameters of the nuclear deal that they're negotiating. And these broad parameters will guide the negotiations as they complete the technical details before a June 30th deadline. These negotiations have been going on since January of 2014. They're very complex. A great deal of progress has been made, and it's just tweaking a few peripheral issues now, and we'll get to an agreement.
Well, that sounds rather optimistic. And let me just ask anyone who's watching, if you would like to submit a question, please email it to info@jstreet.org. Or you can tweet us at jstreet.org, and the dot is a word, it's DOT.org. That's our Twitter handle. Do we know what the last hang-ups are?
Yes, it's clear that research and development on Iran's advanced centrifuges has been one of the key technical hurdles remaining in the talks. Iran is currently enriching uranium for its civilian power program using a very inefficient centrifuge model. It wants to continue research on more advanced models that will enrich uranium more efficiently. But the P5+1, of course, are concerned that that could allow Iran to move quickly to nuclear weapons. So they want to have some limits on research and development. The other area has to do with UN Security Council sanctions. The UN Security Council put sanctions on Iran because it violated its commitments and pursued a nuclear weapons program in secret. Those sanctions will be phased out over the course of an agreement as Iran meets its obligations, but the P5+1 wants to ensure that those sanctions are reimposed if Iran violates an agreement. So determining exactly how to reimpose those sanctions has been a hurdle. But these are resolvable gaps, and both sides are committed to a deal, and I think that's what's most important.
Now, we heard over the weekend that there had been an understanding that Iran would ship spent fuel to Russia to dispose of or deal with, and that the Iranians then said no, that wasn't going to happen. And these were press reports. And does that make a significant difference in these negotiations? Is that a real issue that emerged at the last minute?
Well, a lot of the issues related particularly to Iran's uranium enrichment program and its production of fuel need to be viewed as a package. One of the main goals for the P5+1 is to push Iran's breakout time, which has been commonly understood to mean the amount of time it would take Iran to get enough enriched uranium for one nuclear device to 12 months. Iran can currently do that in 2 to 3 months. So that's a combination of limiting Iran's nuclear program and limiting its stockpile of nuclear material. As you said, at one point it looked like Iran was going to ship that material to Russia. Now Iran is saying it may prefer other options, diluting it down to natural uranium or converting it to a form that's unsuitable for weapons. What really matters is how all of the elements play together, and do they push Iran to that 12-month goal? Whether it's shipped out or diluted, either of those would push Iran back from the brink of nuclear weapons, and then that's really the underlying goal.
Now, of course, we can't view these negotiations technically in a vacuum because there are an immensely complicated political backdrop to these negotiations, both in Iran and in the United States and possibly elsewhere as well. So let's talk about the appearance as these talks have dragged past a deadline of March 31st. And we may argue that it wasn't a deadline. Clearly it wasn't, since we're now on April 1st and we're still talking. But the Obama administration certainly hyped up the deadline, and the world media hyped up the deadline. So as we go into April 1st and then possibly into April 2nd, what does this do in terms of the Obama's administration's ability to sell this deal both to the American people and to Congress?
I think that continuing to talk past the 31st certainly gives ammunition to those critics that oppose a deal. We've already seen a number of members of Congress speak out against the talks, saying that Iran is not serious about reaching an agreement. They're not willing to make the concessions that are necessary to ensure the program is entirely peaceful. What I think the Obama administration needs to be doing now is continuing to remind people that the real deadline for these negotiations is June 30th. That's when they committed to complete the final deal. Also, I think it's important to remember that the only way to effectively limit Iran's nuclear program and guard against any covert nuclear activities is with a good deal. You cannot bomb away the knowledge Iran has amassed about its nuclear program. You cannot sanction it away. Increasing pressure through sanctions right now would only push Iran away from the negotiating table. And that would result in an unconstrained Iranian nuclear program with far less monitoring. That poses far more of a threat to the Middle East and to the United States than a deal that limits Iran's program and puts in place more monitoring.
Now, one of the aspects of this negotiation has been the unity of the P5+1. And let's just remind people, whoever doesn't remember, that the P5 are the United States, Britain, France, China, and Russia. They're the 5 countries that have a veto in the UN Security Council. And the +1 is Germany, because Germany is big and powerful and rich, and it makes Volkswagens. And I guess over the last couple of days, we've heard statements from the Russians that there is a deal, and the Russian foreign minister has been there and left, and then came again, and now he's left again. Is there a split between the P4+1 or the P3+1, the EU countries plus the United States and Russia and China? Has a split emerged between the P5+1?
In general, the P5+1 have remained very united, particularly in the face of the US problems with Russia, the EU problems with Russia. It's quite extraordinary that in general they have all remained on the same page, because they all see Iran with a nuclear weapon as a threat to nonproliferation and a threat to international security. Over the past few days, though, it does seem apparent that Russia and China have a slightly different view on the UN Security Council sanctions. The US and the EU countries would like these sanctions to snap back if Iran violates an agreement. I think Russia and China have indicated that they would prefer a vote in the Security Council if there was a violation.
Which would give them a veto.
Which would give them a veto, exactly. And the United States is, I think, concerned about that. It was very difficult to get all of the 5 permanent members of the Security Council on board to sanction Iran initially, and I think they're concerned that that may not happen again. But I think Lavrov's comments that broad agreement has been reached on the key issues are very encouraging. As I said at the beginning, I think that there is consensus on the major elements of a deal, but there are still some details that need to be worked out that do affect that broad consensus. But in general, I think the P5+1 remains sort of united and committed to getting this deal.
For those who have joined late, our guest is Kelsey Davenport from the Arms Control Association, the policy director of Nonproliferation Policy. And if you have any questions, send them by email to info@jstreet.org. Let's talk a minute about Israel. Obviously, Benjamin Netanyahu, just about a month ago, came to the United States, made a speech to the joint session of Congress, and has been speaking almost every day, if not every day, since then against this agreement. Have his words, his speeches, his efforts had an effect on the negotiations? Have they put a kind of limit above which or below which the Americans can't go?
I think in the negotiating room, the United States has remained very focused on its goals, blocking the uranium and plutonium pathways to the bomb, putting in place intrusive monitoring and verification mechanisms. But I think that Prime Minister Netanyahu's remarks about this deal not being a good deal, about it leaving Iran with too much of a nuclear program and too great of a nuclear capability, has persuaded members of Congress not to support these negotiations. And the congressional element, actions we've seen recently and pushes on legislation that would undermine the talks, I think has hurt the US negotiating team in the talks because it creates the concern amongst the US's negotiating partners and Iran that the US can't follow through on a deal, that Congress will not be willing to pass sanctions relief when necessary, that they won't support the outcome. And planting those seeds of doubt, I think, is certainly not helpful for the negotiations at this time.
Let's talk about the Congress a little more in detail. There have been two bills that have been out there for some time. One is the Kirk-Menendez bill that is co-sponsored by the Democrat Senator Menendez from New Jersey and the Republican Senator Kirk from Illinois. And another one is the Corker bill that's sponsored by a Tennessee Republican who is now the chair of the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate. Maybe you can explain what these bills do, how they're alike, how they're different, and why the administration opposes both of them.
Well, I'll take the first question first.
Okay.
The administration opposes both of these bills because they would derail the negotiations and kill the prospects for a good deal with Iran. They're both incredibly harmful in that way. The Kirk-Menendez bill is a sanctions bill. It basically says that if there is no agreement reached by the end of June, the US will put in place progressively more stringent sanctions over the next 6 months that will result in close to a total economic embargo of Iran by the end of December. This really flies in the face of what the US committed to do in an interim agreement that it and its P5+1 partners in Iran reached in November of 2013. The US committed not to pass any additional sanctions at that time. So this would really violate that agreement. And when Iran has upheld its commitments under that deal, it looks very bad if the US is not willing to do the same. The Corker bill is a little bit more complicated and looks innocuous, but it too poses a great risk to the talks. Under the Corker bill, Congress would be able to vote to approve or to disapprove or take no action on any Iran deal. Congress would have 60 days to do this, and during those 60 days, implementation of the deal would not begin. It also would require the administration to certify that Iran is not involved in any acts of terrorism for there to be any sanctions relief. This is outside the scope of the negotiations. And as I indicated before, Congress does have a role to play, but premature action by Congress, such as a vote to disapprove the deal, sends the wrong message about Congress being willing to follow through on its commitments in the future. So this is not a good role for Congress to be playing, and that's why I see this legislation as extremely unhelpful.
Now, some opponents of the bill, Republicans, have said that the president ought to view this bill as a treaty and bring it to the Senate to advise and consent, in other words, to ratify. In what way is this not a treaty? And so you've talked about Congress having a role. Let's assume there's an agreement. The president unveils the agreement. I guess there'll be a speech from the Oval Office or something, and then he sends details of the agreement to Capitol Hill. What is the legal status of this agreement? Why is it not a treaty? And what is Congress's appropriate role?
Well, this agreement will be an executive agreement reached between Iran and the P5+1. That's an agreement that the president can enter into as per his constitutional prerogative. That then needs to be respected by the United States. It is not legally binding the same way that a treaty is, which requires the advice and consent of the Senate. But it is still, the United States is still obligated, particularly through customary international law.
Could you explain that? Why is it not legally binding, and how is it not legally binding?
Well, because it's not a treaty. When treaties receive the advice and consent of 2/3 of the Senate, and they are then ratified, the U.S. is legally bound to follow through on its commitments. An executive agreement is slightly different. It's not legally binding in the same way that it does not carry that force of law, but the U.S. is still expected to follow through on its commitments. The president enters into hundreds of these types of agreements throughout their terms. So that's a primary difference. Congress, though, still has a role to play in these negotiations. They were very instrumental in passing the sanctions that have helped bring Iran to the negotiating table. And I think an appropriate role for Congress, after an agreement is reached, is to continue to oversee implementation of the deal. Once Congress has a chance to review an agreement, requiring the president to certify to Congress that Iran is complying on a regular basis, I think that's very appropriate. Congress can hold hearings on that. That serves as an important public forum to understand the agreement and the debates around Iran's compliance. Congress will also have to act to lift sanctions in the future. I think that is another appropriate way for Congress to weigh in and evaluate Iran's compliance in the long term.
In terms of lifting sanctions in the future, is that done by a simple majority?
Yes, that will be done by a simple majority.
So the Republicans control the Senate, they control the House of Representatives. How are they going to lift sanctions?
Well, I think the agreement will put the lifting of sanctions several years into an agreement. The limits on Iran's nuclear program will likely last at least 10 years. Some limits will be longer. Some inspections will even be permanent. So a few years from now, when a good record of compliance has been established, when there's more assurance that Iran's nuclear program is entirely peaceful, I think it's more feasible then that Congress could act to lift sanctions.
Let's talk about the Iranian side of the equation a little bit. Because we've heard repeatedly in recent days US officials from Kerry on down say the Iranians have a decision to make, and making it sound as if the P5+1 and the United States have stopped negotiating. They've said their final word, and it's really the Iranians who have to make a decision. When you say the Iranians, you're actually talking about one man, the supreme leader, Khatamai. So is that the case? What kind of pressures are there on him?
Well, I think that in any negotiation, there is going to be a certain amount of posturing and brinkmanship. By no means do I think this negotiation is solely up to the Iranians at this point. I think there is always room for creativity, flexibility, and give and take. But from the Iranian perspective, I think the supreme leader has demonstrated and acknowledged that he is putting a great deal of faith and trust in Foreign Minister Zarif and his negotiating team, and has set out some parameters by which that Zarif has some room to negotiate in. And I think that if Zarif brings back a deal within those parameters, and it certainly seems that he's negotiating for that, the supreme leader will support the agreement. And that will bring tremendous economic benefit to Iran as sanctions are waived and then lifted. And then also will allow them to say that they have retained a peaceful civilian nuclear program. I think both of those elements are quite important.
And what would you say to those who say that the Iranians have worked on this nuclear weapons program with great determination and persistence for decades now, and that they have overcome every obstacle that's been put in their way, including sabotage, assassinations of scientists, Stuxnet, computer viruses, whatever it's been, they have kept plugging away and improving their know-how and improving their program to the point now where they are, one hears, 3 months away from breakout capability. And so why would they stop now?
I think that that's an argument for why we actually need this deal. The United States, the EU, the UN have all placed incredibly tough sanctions on Iran, and their nuclear program has continued. Getting a deal is the only way to get Iran to agree to limit its program, to put in place monitoring and verification in addition to what's already there, and to answer those questions about its past military dimensions. Iran very likely had a nuclear weapons program that it was developing covertly through 2003. It looks like since then, some of those activities may have occurred sporadically, but in general, the weapons program ended then. However, that was in violation of Iran's treaty commitments under the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, and Iran needs to answer for those actions and provide clarification. But what a deal does, in addition to limiting Iran's program, is put in place that monitoring and verification that ensures that Iran will not begin these activities related to weapons development in the future. And I think that we certainly don't want to become so hung up on what Iran has done in the past that we don't safeguard against that eventuality continuing into the future.
Let's come back to the United States again. There was an interesting poll in the Washington Post yesterday that showed that by almost 2-to-1, Americans support this deal, and yet a majority doesn't think that it will work. Now, how did you interpret those findings?
Well, I'm very encouraged that a majority of Americans support diplomacy with Iran. I think that that comes in part from a war weariness in the United States after prolonged conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan. As to Americans thinking that a deal won't work, I attribute that to decades of mistrust between the United States and Iran, really dating back to the overthrow of the Shah and the hostage crisis in 1979. And so many Americans, I think, have grown up viewing Iran in this light as an enemy, and there isn't trust. But if you look at the past year and a half, Iran has fulfilled its commitments under an interim deal. The United States acknowledges that. I think that we can move towards a place where we can reach an agreement and feel comfortable that Iran will follow through, and that the monitoring and verification mechanisms are in place to ensure that Iran is complying. And that's the beauty about this deal. We don't have to trust Iran to follow through on its commitments, because this deal will put in place permanent monitoring and verification measures to ensure that Iran's program is entirely peaceful and that it's abiding by the deal.
Now, what we were told to expect on March 31st, and may still emerge later today or tomorrow, was some kind of framework agreement. But in the last couple of days, we've been hearing that what we're going to get is maybe a bit less than that. So assuming that something emerges, what do you think it's going to be?
Well, I think right now it looks most likely that there will be a statement probably issued by Foreign Minister Zarif from the Iranian side and the European Union Foreign Policy Chief Federica Mogherini for the P5+1 that will say that Iran and the P5+1 have reached a general understanding on all of the major parameters of the deal. So that includes major parameters on uranium enrichment, on the Iraq reactor, research and development, sanctions and monitoring, and that those broad parameters will guide concluding the remaining technical details before the 30th. I think at one point there's hope that there may be more detail released than that. But I think even getting this broad understanding really demonstrates that both sides are committed to reaching an agreement, and that it's possible to overcome these gaps that only 2 years ago seemed almost unbridgeable. So this is certainly a step in the right direction. It certainly will be a breakthrough, And I think it really speaks of the commitments of each side to getting a deal by June 30th.
So you're saying, and excuse me if I misinterpret you, that it will list the things that have been agreed, but it won't actually say in any detail what the agreements are?
I think that that could be the case. I hope that there will be more than that. But, you know, it's a very fluid situation right now. And it's been hampered by the fact that some of the foreign ministers have had to come and go in the past few days. And I think that is at any announcement that indicates that there is progress, that there is general agreement on these areas, will still be hugely important because, you know, in last July and last November, the last two deadlines set for these talks, because there were gaps on significant issues, no announcement like this could be made. So saying that these gaps essentially have been bridged, even in a general sense, is still a breakthrough and still extremely significant.
But yet that leaves President Obama unable to lay out and defend the terms of a deal and very vulnerable to attack as soon as Congress comes back from its Easter recess. What do you say?
I think that it does make it more difficult for President Obama if there are no details. I hope that in the next few hours it may be possible that Iran and the P5+1 reach agreement that would allow them to lay out in more detail the broad parameters of this deal. But I think that Obama can come back to Congress and at least silence some of the critics by saying, you know, you were concerned about whether or not Iran was negotiating in good faith. This is a demonstration that they are. We've reached general agreement on these areas, and the deal is really the only way to guard against a nuclear-armed Iran.
But he's still in effect saying to Congress, trust me.
I think he's saying, trust me, but I think he has a little bit more evidence and ammunition on his side than when he went in July and said, trust me, and then in November and said, trust me. I think now he has at least a statement saying, you know, we have agreement. Because that puts the P5+1 and Iran that much closer to an actual deal. Okay,
and then this legislation that we discussed earlier, Corker, Kirk-Menendez, maybe other legislation will be introduced. Presumably the Republicans have the votes to get it through, both houses. The president vetoes it, and it comes back for a veto override battle. How do you see that going? And, you know, specifically, I guess J Street would be involved in that battle along with your organization and other organizations. What is going to be the role of grassroots advocacy organizations in that battle?
Well, I hope we don't get to that point, but if we do, grassroots will play an extremely important role. I think it will be very important to remind members of Congress that the majority of Americans support diplomacy. I think it's important to point out the detrimental effects that this legislation will have on the talks. And I think it's important also to point out what a deal will accomplish. A deal will block Iran's pathways to the bomb. It will put in place monitoring to guard against a covert program, and it will incentivize Iran to follow through on a deal through sanctions relief. You cannot achieve this through additional sanctions, through a congressional approval or disapproval vote, or even a military strike. So to reiterate that Americans support diplomacy, that diplomacy is the only way to solve this impasse, and then to show members of Congress that the United States is engaged and it cares about this subject will be extremely important.
Let's hope that's what happens. We talked earlier about the Iranians and the Iranian economy and its dependence on oil. The price of oil has obviously dropped rather dramatically, and one hears that actually if the Iranians got access to oil markets, it would drop even further. What's your reading of are the Iranians motivated solely by their wish to get back in the oil market and to do something for their economy, or is there other motivations, perhaps the wish to more reintegrate into the international community, to end its status as a pariah nation in that respect?
I think that Revitalizing its economy is certainly one element, but it's important to remember that so as these sanctions are waived, I don't think that there is going to be a rush back into Iran. There's going to be hesitancy about future sanctions, really until some of these measures are lifted. So I think Iran sees economic improvements, particularly as a long-term goal. But in the short term, removing the stigma over its nuclear program is extremely important. That's one of the reasons why Iran has pushed so hard to remove the UN Security Council sanctions. Iran views these sanctions as illegal, and removing them really justifies that its program is recognized internationally, its nuclear program is recognized, and it's recognized as a peaceful program. So that helps it reintegrate, I think, into the world order. So that, I think, is an equally important motivation.
Now, one thing we haven't spoken about, and we've spoken about a lot of things in this conversation, which has been fascinating for me, is the broader Middle East, and particularly the Sunni Arab states. There was an Arab League meeting just this last weekend. They decided to set up a joint military force, basically to oppose the Iranians, first of all in Yemen, where you have this civil war quickly developing into a catastrophe, and possibly elsewhere. We've heard repeatedly from President Obama, from Secretary Kerry, and from others that if there is no deal, what will happen will be that other countries in the Middle East will embark on their own nuclear programs, and that you would have a nuclear arms race in the Middle East with countries like Saudi Arabia and possibly Egypt initiating their own programs. But if there is a deal, I guess that danger is also present because these countries don't trust the Iranians, from what we've heard. So talk a bit about nuclear proliferation in the Middle East and the dangers of that, and whether the deal helps stop it or actually spurs it on.
I certainly think that a deal strengthens nuclear nonproliferation in the long run. It demonstrates that the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty is still relevant and that countries still value their status as a treaty member. If Iran was not concerned about the treaty, it could have pulled out and pursued its nuclear program without any constraints. But negotiating this deal, I think, reaffirms the importance of the treaty. I also think that from a regional perspective, limiting Iran's nuclear program and putting in place these mechanisms that demonstrate to the region that there is no covert nuclear weapons program will give countries pause about developing their own programs. If Iran's program continued unhindered, then I think you would see countries like Saudi Arabia more seriously intending to pursue their own enrichment programs and coming to a similar sort of nuclear weapons hedging capability that Iran is said to have now. Certainly, though, I think the United States and particularly the European Union and countries that export nuclear technology like China and Russia need to be aware of the dynamics in the region when considering nuclear power programs in the future. The United Arab Emirates is embarked on a nuclear program for civilian power, but has agreed not to enrich its own uranium or reprocess its fuel. So that essentially puts nuclear weapons sort of out of reach for the UAE. Entering into similar agreements with other countries to allow them, to help them develop nuclear power programs, but keep the actual technology for making nuclear fuel out of those countries, I think could be wise. Or setting the precedent that, Iran is agreeing to monitoring and verification beyond what's required of it. That because there are concerns that other countries in the region may pursue nuclear weapons, they too should be subject to that similar, more stringent monitoring and verification. So using Iran as a baseline for developing norms in the region, I think could be beneficial if there is a deal.
Why do these countries, which are rich in oil, including Iran, need nuclear energy? And if they wanted alternative energy, solar would seem to be kind of ideal in those very hot climates. Why do they need nuclear energy?
I think they see nuclear energy as a long-term investment, recognizing that the natural resources of the region are not indefinite, and investing in those programs now can provide energy security, and then also leave the oil and gas that they have available for export as opposed to domestic use.
Okay, my last question, and we haven't touched on it, but we were talking before the call began very briefly about the issue of cheating and of verification and monitoring. And you were telling me that since the failure to stop North Korea becoming a nuclear state, that the verification procedures and mechanisms have improved quite dramatically. Obviously, the Israelis say they expect the Iranians to cheat and cheat successfully. So perhaps a few words on those verification mechanisms and why we should have confidence in them.
Of course. As a member of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Treaty, Iran has an agreement with the International Atomic Energy Agency. It's called the Safeguards Agreement. And that gives the International Atomic Energy Agency access to Iran's declared nuclear facilities to ensure that the material in use in these facilities is for peaceful purposes. But in the early 90s, the cases of Iraq and North Korea demonstrated that these traditional safeguards agreements with the IAEA were not comprehensive enough, and it is still possible for countries to covertly develop nuclear weapons and facilities. So the IAEA strengthened its monitoring and verification mechanisms. It developed an instrument called the Additional Protocol, and that puts in place a stronger monitoring and verification regime. It allows inspectors access to a greater number of facilities. It allows them to inspect more quickly with less notice. It puts in place more accountancy on materials and goods that are used for developing nuclear programs. And this, when ratified by Iran, will be a permanent mechanism. So it will remain in place even after the limits on Iran's nuclear program expire. And I think that getting these monitoring and verification mechanisms right is incredibly important given Iran's past. Iran tried to build 2 nuclear facilities covertly. They had a secret nuclear weapons program. It's these elements that are really why we're negotiating with Iran today. So ensuring that these activities don't continue in the future will be very important to assure the international community that Iran's program is entirely peaceful.
Well, it's been a very comprehensive, educational, informative session. I want to thank Kelsey Davenport of the Arms Control Association for being our guest and for sharing so generously with the time and knowledge. And here at J Street, we are girding up for what we anticipate to be some tough battles on Capitol Hill. If there should be an agreement or a partial agreement or a statement of things that are agreed, we know that the Israelis are against it. We know that the Republicans will try to sabotage it. A lot is at stake here. We'll be no doubt turning to you to help us in this battle. But in the meantime, we have to stay tuned and see what develops later today. And so I want to wish everyone a very happy Passover and thank Kelsey once again. And we'll be having another call, I guess, next week, and details will be sent out as soon as we've nailed them down. So thank you very much from Washington, and goodbye. All right.